The concrete playground radiated heat, like a furnace at 11:30 on that Tuesday morning. The thermometer, already climbing past 98 degrees, with no mercy in sight. Tommy Martinez stood perfectly still in the center of the basketball court. His round face flushed crimson, sweat pouring down his forehead in steady streams that soaked through his oversized Lakers jersey. The other children huddled under the pavilion's meager shade, their eyes wide with a mixture of sympathy and terror, watching as the woman with the clipboard and the permanent scowl continued her methodical pacing around the trembling 12-year-old. "You will stay right there until you learn some discipline," Karen Westfield announced, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence like a blade. "Fat kids don't get to make excuses in my program. You want to play? You earn it by following rules." She adjusted her oversized sunglasses and smoothed her perfectly styled blonde hair, completely unaffected by the brutal heat that was slowly destroying the child before her. The whistle around her neck caught the sunlight, casting sharp reflections across the asphalt. Tommy's lips had gone pale, his breathing shallow and rapid. His hands trembled at his sides as he fought to maintain his balance, the world beginning to tilt and sway around him, behind him. The other children in the summer recreation program watched in horrified silence, too frightened of Karen's wrath to speak up, too young to fully understand what they were witnessing. "Please," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can't. I feel sick." "Speak up when you address me," Karen snapped, stepping closer. "And stop making excuses. This is exactly why kids like you don't succeed. No backbone, no determination, no respect for authority." She turned to address the group of children under the pavilion. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. Rules exist for a reason, and I will not tolerate defiance in any form." The morning had started like any other at Riverside Community Center, with children arriving for the city's flagship summer program that had been running successfully for 15 years. Tommy had been excited, his backpack loaded with his swimming gear and a carefully packed lunch his mother had prepared before her early shift at the hospital. He'd been looking forward to the basketball tournament, practicing his free throws in the driveway every evening since school ended. Karen Westfield had taken over as program director only 3 weeks earlier, replacing beloved Mrs. Henderson, who had retired after decades of service. Karen brought with her a reputation for discipline and structure, along with a teaching philosophy that seemed more suited to military boot camp than childhood recreation. She was a woman in her early 40s, with an immaculate appearance and a voice that could freeze water, wielding her clipboard like a weapon and her authority like a shield against any questioning of her methods. The trouble had begun during morning roll call, when Tommy had asked to use the restroom. Karen had denied the request, stating that bathroom breaks were scheduled for specific times and no exceptions would be made for poor planning. When Tommy had quietly explained that he hadn't had a chance to go before arriving because his bus was late, Karen's expression had hardened like concrete. "Are you arguing with me?" she had asked, her voice deadly quiet. "No, ma'am, Just what? Just think you're special. Just think the rules don't apply to you." Karen had stepped closer, her shadow falling across Tommy's upturned face. "Stand up." Tommy had obeyed, confusion and anxiety radiating from his small frame. The other children had gone silent, sensing the shift in atmosphere, the electricity of impending conflict that adults sometimes brought into their safe spaces without warning. "You will stand in the center of that court." Karen had pointed toward the blazing asphalt. "And you will think about respect. You will stay there until I decide you've learned your lesson about following instructions the first time they're given." Now, 25 minutes later, Tommy swayed on his feet like a tree in a storm. The heat rose from the pavement in visible waves, distorting the air around him. His skin had progressed from red to an alarming pale gray, and his eyes kept losing focus, rolling upward before he'd catch himself and struggle to stay upright. Maria Santos, 8 years old and Tommy's neighbor, finally found her voice. "Mrs. Westfield, he looks really sick. Maybe he should sit down." Karen whirled around, her gaze fixing on Maria with laser intensity. "Did I ask for your opinion, young lady? This is exactly the problem with children today. No respect for authority, always thinking they know better than adults." She gestured toward Tommy without looking at him. "He is learning a valuable lesson about consequences. Perhaps you should focus on your own behavior instead of worrying about others." Maria shrank back, tears beginning to form in her eyes. The other children pressed closer together under the pavilion, creating an instinctive protective huddle against the woman's inexplicable cruelty. At that moment, Jessica Chen, a college student working as a junior counselor, emerged from the community center building with a water cooler and cups. She took one look at Tommy standing motionless in the blazing sun and rushed forward. "Oh my God, what is he doing out there?" Jessica dropped the cooler and started toward Tommy, but Karen's voice stopped her cold. "Step back, Miss Chen. This child is serving a disciplinary consequence, and you will not interfere." Jessica's eyes widened with disbelief. "It's over 100 degrees out there. He could get heat stroke." "He could also learn to follow simple instructions," Karen replied coldly. "Children today are coddled and weak. A little discomfort builds character." "This isn't discomfort. This is dangerous." Jessica pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the director." "I am the director," Karen reminded her, stepping into Jessica's personal space. "And if you continue to question my authority, you'll be looking for a new job. This is a program about discipline and respect, not about catering to every whim and weakness." Jessica looked between Karen and Tommy, her hands shaking with frustration and fear. She was a college student working a summer job, completely unprepared to challenge an authority figure who seemed to hold all the power. But as she watched Tommy's condition deteriorate, something inside her snapped. "I don't care," she said quietly, then louder. "I don't care about my job. This is wrong." She started walking toward Tommy again. Karen grabbed Jessica's arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. "You will not move another step, or I will have you arrested for interfering with disciplinary procedures and insubordination." The confrontation had drawn a crowd. Parents arriving early for pickup stopped at the fence, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. Mrs. Patterson, a grandmother picking up her twin grandsons, pulled out her phone and began recording, her instincts telling her that something was deeply wrong with what she was witnessing. Tommy's knees buckled. He caught himself, but barely. His small hands pressed against his thighs as he fought to remain upright. A thin line of vomit escaped his lips, splashing onto the scorching asphalt, where it immediately began to sizzle. "He's going to pass out!" Maria screamed, no longer caring about Karen's rules or threats. But Karen seemed oblivious to the crisis unfolding before her. Or perhaps she simply didn't care. "He is learning discipline," she repeated, as if saying it enough times would make it true. Children need to understand that actions have consequences. That comfort is earned, not given freely. Mrs. Patterson had seen enough. "Someone call 911, she shouted from beyond the fence. "That child is having heat stroke." Other parents began gathering, their voices rising in concern and anger. Several pulled out phones, some calling emergency services, others beginning to record the scene. The situation was spiraling beyond Karen's control, but she seemed determined to maintain her position, to prove some twisted point about authority and respect. Tommy's eyes rolled back in his head. For a moment, time seemed suspended, the entire world holding its breath as the 12-year-old boy swayed in the merciless heat. Then, like a small tree finally succumbing to a hurricane, he collapsed. His body hit the asphalt with a sound that would haunt the witnesses for months afterward. A dull, final thud that seemed to echo across the playground, despite the chaos erupting around them. Jessica broke free from Karen's grip and sprinted toward Tommy, no longer caring about consequences or authority, or anything except the motionless child lying on the burning pavement. "Call an ambulance," Jessica screamed as she knelt beside Tommy, her hands hovering over his unconscious form, afraid to move him, but desperate to help. "He's not responding. His skin is burning hot." The parents outside the fence were now shouting, several climbing over the chain link to reach the playground. "Mrs. Patterson continued recording, her voice shaking as she provided commentary for what would soon become viral evidence of unthinkable cruelty. Karen stood frozen, her clipboard clutched against her chest, her face cycling through expressions of anger, confusion, and the first dawning realization that she might have pushed too far. But even then, even with an unconscious child at her feet and parents screaming for justice, she couldn't seem to grasp the magnitude of what she had done. "He was just being dramatic," she said, her voice smaller now but still defiant. "Children always exaggerate when they don't want to face consequences." The ambulance arrived within minutes, paramedics rushing onto the playground with equipment and urgency that made Karen's casual cruelty seem even more monstrous in comparison. They worked quickly to stabilize Tommy, checking his temperature, starting an IV, loading him onto a stretcher with practiced efficiency that spoke to how serious his condition had become. "Temperature's 106. One paramedic called out, "Severe heat exhaustion. Possible heat stroke." "How long was he out in this heat?" "At least 30 minutes, Jessica answered, tears streaming down her face. "She made him stand out there as punishment. I tried to stop it, but she wouldn't let me." The paramedic's face darkened as he looked toward Karen, who had retreated toward the building, suddenly eager to distance herself from the scene. 30 minutes in this heat. That's criminal negligence at minimum. As the ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing, Mrs. Patterson approached Jessica, with her phone still recording. "I got it all," she said quietly. "Every word, every moment. That woman needs to answer for what she's done." By evening, the video had spread across social media like wildfire. Mrs. Patterson's footage, combined with testimonies from Jessica and several parents, painted a picture of systematic cruelty that shocked the community. The clip showed Tommy's deteriorating condition, Karen's callous indifference, and the final, heartbreaking moment when the child collapsed under the relentless sun. Comments poured in by the thousands, each one expressing outrage, disbelief, and demands for justice. The story was picked up by local news stations, then national outlets, each broadcast amplifying the community's fury and Tommy's suffering. The hashtag #JoshJusticeForTommy began trending, along with HOA Karen and Josh Protect Our Children. What none of the online commenters knew, what none of the news reports had yet discovered, was that Tommy Martinez was not just another child in the summer program. His father was Robert Martinez, the city's vice mayor, a man who had built his political career on family values and child welfare advocacy. Robert had been in budget meetings all day, his phone on silent, completely unaware that his son was fighting for his life just miles away. The call came as Robert was reviewing proposed changes to the city's youth program's budget. His assistant knocked on his office door, her face pale and urgent. "Mr. Martinez, your wife called. Tommy's in the hospital. You need to go now." The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of traffic lights and mounting panic. Robert's wife, Carmen, met him in the emergency room, her eyes red from crying, her nurse's scrubs still damp with tears and perspiration. "How is he?" Robert asked, pulling Carmen into his arms. "Stable, but they're worried about kidney damage from the dehydration," Carmen whispered against his shoulder. "Robert, you need to know what happened. You need to see the video." Carmen showed him Mrs. Patterson's recording on her phone, her hands shaking as she held the device. Robert watched in growing horror as his son stood motionless in the blazing heat, watched Karen's casual cruelty, watched Tommy collapse like a broken doll onto the burning asphalt. When the video ended, Robert sat in stunned silence for several long moments. His political training had taught him to control his emotions, to think strategically, even in crisis. But this was his child, his baby boy, treated like an animal by a woman paid by the city to care for children. "She needs to be arrested," Carmen said quietly. "This isn't discipline. This is abuse." Robert nodded, his jaw set with grim determination. "She will be. But first, I need to make sure this never happens to another child. Ever." The next morning, Robert Martinez stood before a packed press conference room, Tommy's hospital bracelet still visible on his wrist, where he'd worn it in solidarity with his son. Cameras flashed, and reporters leaned forward as the vice mayor approached the podium, his face grave with purpose. "Yesterday, my 12-year-old son nearly died because an adult in a position of trust decided that cruelty was an acceptable form of discipline," Robert began, his voice steady despite the emotion radiating from his frame. What happened to Tommy Martinez was not an isolated incident of poor judgment. It was systematic abuse disguised as authority. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the assembled crowd. "I am here today, not just as Tommy's father, but as an elected official who has failed in my duty to protect the children of this city. The summer recreation program operates under city oversight, with city funding, in city facilities. What happened to my son happened on our watch, and that is unacceptable." Robert announced a comprehensive investigation into all city youth programs, immediate suspension of Karen Westfield pending criminal charges, and the establishment of a child protection task force with real authority to investigate and prevent abuse. He also revealed something that sent shockwaves through the room and the community watching online. "Our investigation has already uncovered evidence that Ms. Westfield's behavior was not limited to yesterday's incident," Robert continued, his voice hardening. "We have documented at least 12 other instances of inappropriate discipline, intimidation, and potential abuse during her brief tenure as program director. Children were forced to perform excessive physical exercise as punishment. Food was withheld. Bathroom breaks were denied for hours at a time." The room erupted with questions and shocked murmurs. Robert raised his hand for silence. "But perhaps most disturbing of all, we have discovered that Ms. Westfield was hired despite failing a background check that revealed similar incidents at her previous position in Bakersfield, California. The hiring decision was made by a single administrator who chose to ignore these red flags, putting our children at risk for the sake of filling a position quickly. This was the midpoint twist that changed everything. Karen Westfield wasn't just a cruel woman who had gone too far. She was a predatory employee who had been allowed into the system despite clear warning signs. The failure wasn't just individual cruelty, but institutional negligence that had enabled a dangerous person to harm children repeatedly. Robert announced his intention to pursue criminal charges not just against Karen, but against the administrator who had hired her, knowing about her history. He also committed to personally reviewing every employee in every city youth program, ensuring that proper safeguards were in place to prevent similar failures in the future. "This ends now," Robert declared, his voice rising with passion. No child will ever again be subjected to abuse in the name of discipline on my watch. No parent will ever again have to wonder if their child is safe in city programs. And no employee will ever again be allowed to use their position of authority to terrorize the children we are sworn to protect. The press conference made national news, with Robert's emotional but determined response, drawing praise from child advocacy groups and politicians across the country. The video of Tommy's collapse, combined with Robert's revelations about Karen's history and the institutional failures that enabled her abuse, became a rallying cry for better protection of children in government programs nationwide. Karen Westfield was arrested at her home that evening, charged with child endangerment, assault, and criminal negligence. The district attorney, under intense public pressure and armed with overwhelming evidence, announced that her office would seek the maximum penalties available under state law. The administrator, who had ignored Karen's background check, was also arrested, charged with willful negligence and endangering the welfare of children. The scandal reached deep into city government, forcing a complete overhaul of hiring practices and child protection protocols. But the real climax came 2 weeks later, at the city council meeting that had been called to address the community's demands for accountability and reform. The council chambers were packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds filling the lobby and sidewalks outside. Parents, children, teachers, and community leaders had come to make their voices heard, to ensure that Tommy's suffering would result in meaningful change. Robert took his seat at the council table, looking out over the sea of faces that included many of the children from the summer program, now accompanied by parents who would never again trust blindly in institutional authority. Tommy sat in the front row beside his mother, still pale but determined to face the woman who had nearly killed him. Karen Westfield, released on bail pending trial, had chosen to attend the meeting against her lawyer's advice. She sat near the back, her previous confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone who had finally grasped the consequences of her actions. She was flanked by legal counsel and seemed to shrink smaller with each speaker who approached the podium to share their experiences with her reign of terror. Jessica Chen was the first to speak, her voice stronger now than it had been that terrible day on the playground. I tried to stop what was happening to Tommy, and I was threatened with arrest for wanting to save a child's life. This woman turned compassion into a crime and cruelty into policy. How many other children suffered because adults were too afraid to challenge her authority? Maria Santos, accompanied by her parents, stepped up to the microphone next. Despite being only 8 years old, her words carried the weight of witnessed trauma. She made us scared to help Tommy. She made us scared to be kind. That's not how grown-ups are supposed to act. Parent after parent shared similar stories, painting a picture of systematic intimidation and abuse that had poisoned what should have been a place of joy and growth for children. The summer program, designed to provide safe, enriching activities for working families, had become a source of fear and trauma under Karen's leadership. When it came time for public comment to end, Robert stood and addressed the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of his office, but the pain of a father who had nearly lost his child to institutional failure. The changes we are implementing today are not just policy adjustments, he said, looking directly at Karen as he spoke. They are a promise that never again will someone be allowed to terrorize children in the name of discipline. Never again will hiring decisions be made without proper oversight. And never again will a child's cry for help be ignored because an adult is more afraid of authority than they are committed to protecting innocence. The council voted unanimously to approve Robert's comprehensive reform package, which included mandatory background checks for all youth program employees, surprise inspections by independent monitors, and a zero-tolerance policy for any form of physical or psychological abuse disguised as discipline. They also established the Tommy Martinez Child Protection Fund, using money recovered from Karen's seized assets to provide counseling services for affected children and additional training for program staff throughout the city. As the meeting concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Karen Westfield made one final attempt to justify her actions. She approached the microphone during the final moments of public comment, her voice shaking with a mixture of desperation and lingering defiance. "I was trying to teach these children discipline," she said. Her words met with angry murmurs from the crowd. "In my day, children learned respect through consequences. I never intended for anyone to get hurt." The response was immediate and thunderous. Parents shouted their outrage, children cried, and the entire chamber erupted in voices demanding justice. But it was Tommy himself who provided the most devastating response. Standing slowly and walking to the microphone with the careful, measured steps of someone who had stared death in the face and survived. "You didn't teach me discipline," Tommy said, his young voice cutting through the chaos like a bell. "You taught me that some adults can't be trusted. You taught me that power can make people cruel. But you also taught me that there are good people who will stand up when someone is being hurt, even when it's scary." He turned to look at Jessica, at Mrs. Patterson, at his parents, at the crowd of community members who had rallied around him. "You didn't break me. You made me stronger, and you made all of us stronger together." The silence that followed Tommy's words was profound, broken only by the sound of Karen Westfield quietly leaving the chamber, her legal team hurrying behind her as she faced the reality that her actions had not only destroyed a child's sense of safety, but had galvanized an entire community against her. 3 months later, Karen Westfield pled guilty to multiple charges and was sentenced to 2 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation and a lifetime ban from working with children. The administrator who had hired her received a 1-year sentence and was permanently barred from government employment. The civil lawsuit filed by Tommy's family resulted in a significant settlement that funded expanded mental health services for all city youth programs and established an endowment for child protection training throughout the region. But the real victory came in the form of systemic change that rippled far beyond the borders of their city. Robert's reform model was adopted by municipalities across the state, then the country, creating a new standard for child protection in government programs that made Karen's type of abuse far more difficult to perpetrate and conceal. Tommy returned to the summer program the following year, but to a transformed environment where children's voices were heard, where kindness was valued over rigid authority, and where adults understood that their role was to nurture and protect rather than to intimidate and control. On the anniversary of his collapse, Tommy stood in the same spot on the playground where he had nearly died, but now the area was shaded by new trees planted by community volunteers. A small plaque nearby read, "In honor of all children who have found their voice in the face of injustice, may we always listen." The summer program had not just survived Karen Westfield's reign of terror. It had emerged stronger, safer, and more committed to its original mission of providing joy and growth for children. Jessica Chen had been promoted to program director, bringing with her a philosophy that emphasized compassion, communication, and the radical idea that children deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. As Tommy stood under the shade of those new trees, surrounded by friends who had witnessed his darkest moment and chosen to stand with him in its aftermath, he reflected on how suffering had been transformed into strength, how cruelty had ultimately generated compassion, and how a single moment of injustice had catalyzed a movement for change that would protect countless children for generations to come. The playground was filled with laughter now, the sound of children at play without fear, without the shadow of arbitrary authority casting darkness over their joy. Parents watched from benches, confident that their children were truly safe, not just physically, but emotionally, in an environment that honored their humanity and nurtured their growth. Robert Martinez had kept his promise. The system had been changed, the policies reformed, and the culture transformed. But more than that, a community had learned that silence in the face of injustice was complicity, that authority without compassion was tyranny, and that protecting children required not just good intentions, but vigilant action and the courage to speak truth to power. The story of Tommy Martinez and Karen Westfield became more than a cautionary tale about the abuse of authority. It became a template for community response to institutional failure and a testament to the power of ordinary people to demand extraordinary change when the safety of children was at stake. Years later, when Tommy graduated from high school as valedictorian, his speech would return to that sweltering day on the playground, but not as a story of victimization. Instead, he would describe it as the moment he learned that justice was not something that happened to people, but something that people made happen through courage, persistence, and the refusal to accept that cruelty was ever an acceptable response to childhood. The program that had nearly killed him had become his greatest teacher, not through Karen's harsh lessons about arbitrary authority, but through the community's response that taught him about resilience, advocacy, and the power of people united around a common cause of protecting innocence and promoting justice. And in community centers across the country, where similar reforms had taken root, inspired by Tommy's story, children played safely under the watchful eyes of adults who understood that their primary job was not to break young spirits in the name of discipline, but to nurture them in the service of hope, growth, and the boundless possibility that lived within every child who deserved to be protected, respected, and allowed to flourish in the warmth of genuine care rather than the scorching heat of manufactured cruelty.